Okay, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try and tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in Scotland over the last 20 years. So I'm a psychologist, so much of what I'll talk about is really trying to look, when I talk about getting inside the suicidal mind, I'm really talking about the psychology of suicide and trying to help us understand why, sadly, over 800,000 people each year across the globe end their own lives. And obviously, people who work in crisis helplines are really at the front line of speaking to, sadly, some of those individuals who then do take their own lives. So what I'll present is a range of different types of studies or experiments that we've been doing. So our work is a combination of working with people within 24 hours of a suicide attempt and trying to understand the suicidal mind in that crucial moment of crisis. We also do work in a sort of an experimental context in which we're really trying to get inside the nuts and bolts of why is it that one individual who experiences one set of circumstances thinks about taking their own life, and another individual who experiences maybe exactly the same circumstances and they don't try and take their own lives. So it's really trying to unravel that complex puzzle, which is the suicidal mind. The broader context will be, I've developed a psychological model of why we think people may take their own lives. It's called the Integrated Motivational Volitional Model, which is a bit of a mouthful. So it's just the IMV model. And really, that's what I'm hoping to really convey today. And then in those of you who attend my workshop later after lunch, I will go into more detail into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the model. So I have a tendency to speak fast. So for the translation purposes, is this okay? I'm trying to see the translator. And do people in the audience, is that okay? Yeah? Yes? The other amusing, well, a thing which I think is amusing is there's two of me. In some of the studies, you will see another O'Connor. So I have an identical twin brother, and who's also a psychologist. So some of the reasons why I can't stand still and I have a tendency to talk fast is I'm always running away from my twin brother. Okay, so moving on to the serious business, all of the published material that I will talk about today is available on our website. And those of you who follow Twitter or do Twitter, we talk about our research and other things on Twitter for those who are interested. So I will just try and give you some highlights from the slides. And as I say, all of the material, including podcasts and other blogs and so on, are available on our website. So what I've said already is really trying to get inside the suicidal mind. The way I'll do that is I will make the case for psychological markers, because to my mind, suicide is ultimately a psychological phenomenon, because an individual makes a decision to take their own life. Now, there are obviously many, many different types of risk factors. We know there are clinical risk factors like depression. We know there are social risk factors like deprivation and disadvantage. But ultimately, and there also are genetic and biological and cultural factors. But to my mind, what's key is how all of those factors come together such that any one individual, and sadly over 800,000 individuals each year, when they look at their world through their eyes, when they think of their past, their present, and crucially, what the future holds for them, that they can see no other option. And as suicide has been described in the past as a permanent solution to often temporary problems. And in addition to that, we know suicide is the ultimate form of social problem solving. We're trying to end the pain, and you will know as well as probably much, much better than me, that people who are acutely suicidal are often not wanting to die, but they're wanting the pain to end. So what I'm going to try and highlight is how somebody feels that pain, and then what we can do to understand that pain, and then hopefully each one of us in our different ways can intervene to make that pain less severe or less painful. So I will then, as I said already, focus in on my model and give some examples of some of the key factors. And then at the very end of the talk, I will focus in on this transition from thoughts to attempts. As somebody who's been working in the field of suicidology for more than 20 years, I think this is probably our most important question to answer. Because we know that lots and lots of people have suicidal thoughts, but thankfully, the majority of people with suicidal thoughts don't make that transition. They don't make the transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. And so what we try to do in the work, and some of the work that my lab has been doing, is understanding that distinction. And we sometimes call that understanding the intention-behavior gap. What is it that is different from somebody who thinks about suicide and goes no further? How are they similar or different from somebody who makes that transition of making the act of suicide, attempting suicide? And then hopefully we'll end up with some conclusions. So the obvious question then is, well, why do people kill themselves? And each one of us in the room will have our own answer to that question. But I think we would all be agreed in that there is never one single explanation for suicide. And as I've said already, the risk factors that lead to suicide span the whole domain from, as I've said already, from social and cultural factors right through to clinical and biological factors. But if you did a literature search in the scientific literature, you would see a list of these sorts of factors. And this list is not exhaustive, and nor does it in any particular order. But it's what we think of as the key dominant risk factors for suicide. So if we look at the very top of that list, we've got mental disorder or mental illness, or whatever term you want to use. And we know that in Western countries, the overwhelming majority of people who die by suicide, that the suicide occurs in the context of mental illness. So upwards of 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental illness of some description. And it's most commonly a mood disorder like depression. So one of my key messages is, yes, we know that mental disorder is an important risk factor for suicide, but here's, I think, what is even more important, though. Having a mental disorder does not mean you will kill yourself. Indeed, if we just focus in on depression for 1 second, so depression is a mental disorder most commonly associated with suicide, but less than 5% of people with depression kill themselves. So that's a really, I think that's a really stark and important message. Because it's a message of hope in a sense, because it's suggesting that, yes, we can intervene, because most people with depression don't kill themselves, but it leads us to a very important question. And that very important question is, what is different about the 5% of people with depression who kill themselves? How are they different from the 95% of people who don't? And this is where I think psychology really comes into its own, because I think there's a number of psychological factors which help us understand that factor and understand that distinction. And indeed, from this list here, the single strongest, the most important predictor of whether you die by suicide is whether you've tried previously. And that leads me to another sort of key message, is that I see suicide as a behavior first and foremost. Independent of mental disorder, suicide is a behavior. It's a behavior in exactly the same way that smoking is a behavior. But the sad reality is obviously the consequences for too many people are immediate and obviously lethal. But this slide illustrates the point that there's lots of risk factors out there, but a list like that doesn't help us understand which individual with depression, for example, or which individual who is unemployed will take their own life. It just illustrates groups of people at risk, but it doesn't necessarily help you or me, you in the context of speaking to somebody in a crisis helpline, it doesn't help us understand which individual is really, really at risk. And that's why I think we need to really focus in on the psychology of the suicidal mind to answer that question better. And indeed, another message which relates to this focus in on, understandably, this focus on mental disorder, is that there's a general recognition that we need to move beyond psychiatric illness explanations to understand suicide. And indeed, this slide is really just trying to highlight, certainly in the UK, and I know for most Western countries, that the reason we focus in on mental illness is because we've got treatments for mental illness. So the challenge is, well, what happens those people, many of whom you will speak to on phones or meet face-to-face in crisis, who don't meet the criteria for mental illness? They're in absolute acute and chronic distress, but don't meet the mental illness criteria. And often that makes us feel helpless because we don't know necessarily what to do. So my message is, yes, it's important to look at mental illness, but that's only one factor in a complex array of factors, and we shouldn't have a situation in which mental illness is a precursor for treatment. And I think that's really challenging, but is an important message. So the complexity around suicide and self-harm or attempted suicide is illustrated by this slide here. And this is a slide we put together with regard to adolescent suicide and self-harm, but it is applicable across the lifespan. There's lots to digest in this slide, so I'll just highlight 2 or 3 key points for the purposes of today. The first thing is recognizing that in a graphical way, in a model or a pathway, we've got lots of different factors, and psychiatric disorder is there, and we've got vulnerability factors here, and we've got lots of negative life events and social problems. We know that people who die by suicide disproportionately experience negative life events. But what's crucial for the purposes of today is here. And the work that we try to do is getting inside this black box of understanding why is it for some people who experience psychological distress that it becomes suicidal in content. Because the sad reality is that if you're depressed or distressed and you experience suicidal thinking in one depressive episode or one distressing episode, you're much, much, much more likely to experience suicidal thinking again the next time you feel distressed. So it's trying to understand, and the remainder of the talk is trying to understand the unique type of psychological distress which has suicidal features. Now, when I got into this field 20-odd years ago, to my thinking, it was dominated by epidemiology. The focus was on how many people killed, were they male, were they female, were they married, or whatever. And sometimes we forgot about the fact that behind each of those statistics, there was obviously a personal tragedy. So what is going to appear now is a suicide note of a man who has taken his own life. And I put it up there for 2 reasons. One reason is to remind us, not that you need reminding in this room, of the tragedy, the personal tragedy, but secondly, to remind us that when we go through the remainder of my talk, some of the stuff I hope to say between now and the end of my talk will, I hope, help us better understand why that suicide note was written. If you are reading this, I have had enough and I'm dead. You can see how bollocks my life is. I can't think of any day when things have gone well recently. And who really cares about me anyway? I am a failure, can do nothing right, useless, trapped. With my girlfriend, I was really happy for once in my life. I tried my hardest with her, and I was shit, and I still failed. What did she want? I didn't know what to do. And I've read that suicide note hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of times. And it gets me every single time. And what I suppose it gets me partly is the everydayness of it. Each one of us in this room can empathize with some situation like that. But thankfully, we're still here to tell the story and to tell our own story and our own lives. And what's such tragedy is the fact that in so many ways that suicide could have been, I don't know, we hoped it could have been and should have been prevented. And so for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to try and do is try and get us a bit more further forward in understanding the characteristics of why that suicide note was written. So where that brings me to is what I'm trying to make in terms of key points. The first point is the recognition that psychiatric illness is important, but most people with psychiatric illness don't kill themselves. We need more specific markers, and that's this. I'm going to focus in on psychology. And then the point I made at the start is this transition from thinking about suicide and attempting suicide. So I'm going to endeavor to try and answer some of these questions now. So this is a scary slide, so don't worry. And the translation, people who are doing the translation, I'm not going to read through this slide. But again, it illustrates, when I look at the research field in terms of the psychology of suicide, if I had to do that slide 20 years ago, it would be 1/3 of the size it is now. And the positive message has been in the last 20 years, there's been a huge growth in terms of understanding the psychology of suicide. And those of you who are interested in more detail, I'll talk more about some of these factors in the workshop this afternoon, but also there is more material on the website on these. But my message from this slide is when we try and understand the suicidal mind, we tend to look at what we think of are personality factors or relatively stable things about people. But where most of the work is on the way we think. It's on cognition. Because ultimately, when somebody's making a decision to take their own lives, what's driving that decision is the way they're processing what's going on in their world. It's how they're responding to challenges like relationship breakdown, to having no work or no jobs, feeling ashamed. These are all important risk factors, but they're only risk factors, largely speaking, insofar as they impact on the way you think and the way you view your future and the way you view your past, such that you then think, crikey, in this tunnel vision. See, I needed a lapel mic because I do this a lot and it doesn't work so well when I'm holding a mic. So try and think of a tunnel, and the suicidal mind is often characterized as tunnel vision. And that individual then, for whatever reasons, those set of cognitions which are interacting with other factors make it more likely that the only option that individual sees is suicide as a solution to their problems. And then the social context is really, really important, and I'll come back to that. And negative life events is really, really important. And we know there's a growing research on the importance of early life adversity. So when bad things happen early on in life for children, and it interrupts the attachment process. And also we know it also has impact on brain development, which is associated with vulnerability. But what I tried to do a few years ago was bring together these risk factors into a meaningful model. So that led me to develop the IMV model. And again, I'll go into more detail about the model in the workshop. But what this model simply tries to understand is why suicidal thoughts emerge for some people and not for others. So in a very straightforward way, I'm just going to focus in on these bits, first of all. So in a very straightforward way, the model argues that the co-experience, so being defeated and humiliated, from which you cannot escape, so this sense of being trapped, this overwhelming entrapment, is the key psychological driver for suicide. So it's a co-experience, very simply, of you're defeated and humiliated from which you cannot escape. And statistically speaking, if you experience both of these, you're much more likely to develop suicidal thinking. And the suicidal thinking is the response to the sense of overwhelming entrapment. This overwhelming, I can't stop the pains, the thoughts in my head, and the only thing I can think about is suicide as an option. And then the other bits of the model here are a range of psychological factors which appeared in the previous slide, which make it more likely that the more of these you have, the more likely you go from feeling defeated, going across to feeling trapped, going across to feeling suicidal. And again, I will go into more detail about the model later this afternoon. So then the key question then is, if you're suicidal, what makes it more likely that you'll actually cross that bridge and attempt suicide? And according to my model, you're more likely to make this transition if you've got lots of what I call volitional moderators. And what a volitional moderator is any factor which facilitates the likelihood that you will act on your thoughts of suicide. So examples are, the more impulsive I am. The more impulsive an individual is, the more likely they are to act on their thoughts of suicide. The greater access to the means they have, more likely they are to act on suicide. And indeed, one of the key challenges we all have is ensuring that when somebody is actively suicidal, that we restrict the access to the means of suicide. Knowing other people, so imitation, or we sometimes describe it as exposure to suicide. We know that if you know other people, family members or friends who've died by suicide or attempted suicide, you're much more likely. And the last one I'll mention for the purposes of today is this one here on capability. And capability is this idea that you have to acquire the capacity to actually enact the suicide attempt. And we think that's made up of at least two components. One is fearlessness about dying, because we have to overcome that life instinct. And so people who are suicidal, we think, are less fearful about dying. And we also think that they have a heightened physical pain tolerance, so they can actually withstand the physical pain for carrying out the act of suicide. So that's the model very, very briefly, which is this middle bit is understanding why suicidal thoughts emerge, and entrapment is really important. And then the last bit is understanding that transition from suicidal thinking to suicidal attempts. Now, what I'm going to present now are some studies in which we've looked at different components of the model to give you some sense of how we've understood what is in the figure, and hopefully what can help us intervene with those who are vulnerable. So, for example, in some of our studies, within 24 hours of a suicide attempt, we will assess people in hospital, and the people who have just attempted suicide will complete a range of measures for us. And then in this study, we then track them over the next 4 years to determine whether we can predict who is more or less likely to attempt suicide or die by suicide. And that's really, really important, because I have to first of all demonstrate that I can predict who may try and kill themselves, and if I can predict that, then I can intervene. And in this study, I'll just highlight the key points, is that when we looked at which factors predicted who was more likely to kill themselves, all of these were important. So there's no big surprises. Each of these were really important factors on their own. But when we ask the question, which factor is most important, or which factors are most important in predicting suicide or a suicide attempt in the next 4 years, past behavior was important, but I can't do anything about that. The only other factor which was important was their level of entrapment. So people who, when we saw them in hospital, reported high levels of entrapment, they were statistically more likely to try and kill themselves again in the future. So one of my messages is we should be focusing in on trying to assess entrapment when we speak to people who are suicidal, and then hopefully try and change that entrapment to make it less likely that people become or remain trapped. Okay, so that is all I'll say about entrapment. But what I want to focus in on now is another factor, and you will have come across it in different ways when speaking to people who are suicidal, but you may not have used the language that I'm using. So what's up here is a personality type, which is called social perfectionism. And we think it's really important in suicidal risk. And what social perfectionism is, it's not the standards or expectations that we set ourselves, but it's what we think other people expect of us. And that if we fail to meet those expectations, other people will think badly of us, and then we internalize that as self-criticism. Now, for some people, this social perfectionism is very, very high. People are really, really concerned about letting others down. So letting other important people in their life down. And we've done loads of work on this, and it's consistently an important risk factor for suicide. So the formal definition is that it taps beliefs about excessive, often unrealistic expectations we perceive significant others have of us. And we've done loads and loads and loads and loads of studies. It's just always bad for you, okay? And again, that's a technical description. It's just bad for you. So, but the scary thing is, it's very difficult to intervene and change social perfectionism. And we need to do more work in trying to change it. And again, this is just an illustration of why we think it's important or bad for you. And why we think it's bad for you is that what I describe here is the stress threshold lowering effect. So what we think is that people who have high levels of social perfectionism, when they encounter stress or negative life events, they're much, much more likely to be distressed. It's much more likely to have a negative impact on them. A very simple way of describing it is they have a thin skin rather than a thick skin. And it means that more of the negative, bad stuff that goes on in their life gets into them and affects them psychologically. And again, we've shown this in adults, in adolescents, in older people, in people who are really disadvantaged, in people who are more well off. We've experienced it lots and lots. And as I said, it's always negative. I'll just move on from that slide because I've already made this point. Okay, what I want to focus in on now is something which is very simple, but very dangerous. It's the way we think about the future. When we think about hopelessness, which is the characteristic of the suicidal mind which we think is most dangerous, this pessimism for the future, well, that pessimism can be two things. It can be two specific types of the way in which types of future thinking. There is positive future thinking, and there's negative future thinking. And they are exactly what we think they are. Positive future thinking is just asking people what they are looking forward to. And negative future thinking is asking them what they're not looking forward to, what they're worried about. And there is a task, a very simple task, the future thinking task, in which we formally assess that. And what a colleague in London, Andrew MacLeod, first showed, and we've since replicated it and shown it time and again, is that what's important in the context of suicidal risk, it isn't negative future thoughts. So suicidal people are not overwhelmed with negativity. The crucial thing is that the suicidal people, individuals who are suicidal, have much less positive future thoughts. Very simple, but very dangerous. So we think that initially it's the absence of future thinking is bad for you because it's not protecting you. It's not protecting you when you're in crisis. And we have done numerous studies showing this is really the simple way of looking at positive future thoughts is bad for you. And if you're feeling trapped, for example, and you have very few positive future thoughts, you're much more likely to become suicidal. However, we've shown time and again, bad, right? But nobody had looked at what positive future thoughts people were telling us about. So we simply asked people, what are you looking forward to in the next week, year, and 5 to 10 years? And what people will do is tell us about, I'm looking forward to seeing my partner, playing in the park with my children, going on holidays, things like that. But we wondered, well, what happens in terms of thinking about content? Are positive future thoughts always good for you? And our rationale was, in the context of this idea of entrapment, is, well, actually, they're not, or they may not always be good for you. So say there's something about yourself that you want to change. Say you want to be more confident. Say you want to be happier or have more self-esteem. What happens if in the future I am no longer happy? I'm not happy. I have no more self-esteem. I don't feel any better about myself. That may be problematic because that might add to your sense of being trapped. So we looked at this in a context with people who had attempted suicide, and our question was, okay, all the research previously shows that low positive future thinking is bad, but we reasoned that a particular type of future thinking, these things to do with you and only you, which are called intra-personal future thoughts. So they're just these things like, I want to be better, I want to be happy. But we reasoned with a really chronically ill population is that if you've got lots of those positive future thoughts, that's going to be problematic and make you more suicidal. And we investigated that. So this intrapersonal is that's just the formal definition, which I will not read, but it's what I've just told you. And very simply, we asked the question, well, actually, maybe these types of intrapersonal future thoughts, if you've lots of those, because it adds to your sense of entrapment if these are not met, you maybe become more suicidal. And as you'll see in 1 second, that's exactly what we found. So we followed up a sample of people who had attempted suicide, and we asked what factors predicted whether you attempted suicide again in the next 15 months. What we see were basically past behavior predicted repeat suicidal behavior. And then no surprises here. Each of these predicted how suicidal you were and whether you were attempted suicide in the next 15 months. But crucially though, and I'll just highlight the key point in this next slide, when we looked at the future thoughts, remember, this is just asking somebody the way about what they're looking forward to. And what we find is just highlighted here is that the people, when we saw them in hospital, who had lots of these intrapersonal future thoughts, that really, I'm trying to change myself, they were much more likely to attempt suicide in the next 15 months. Now, the reason that's important is that when we look at it in the broad context of asking which of the factors is most important, this is a poor slide, but take my word for it, that the most important predictor of whether you attempted suicide, when you looked at everything together, were these positive future thoughts, these particular type of positive future thoughts. Now, the reason that's important is because when we're speaking to somebody on a crisis hotline, or when we're speaking to somebody in person, what we should be trying to assess is, yes, their reasons for living, what they're looking forward to, but we should be trying to assess how realistic those expectations are. And that we have to maybe accept, part of it is accepting who we are, as well as trying to change ourselves. And albeit this is something very simple, it's just one set of positive future thoughts, it's really, really powerful. And it highlights to me the importance of how small things can make a huge, huge impact and huge difference. Okay, in the last 5 or 10 minutes, what time is it?
Time over.
Is the time over? Okay, so let me just finish. In the last 5 minutes, I'll just summarize. Is it over? Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I'll just summarize this last bit. Which is, that was unhelpful. Is that, so one of the messages I said I focused in on is the development of suicidal thoughts. The last bit is we've done lots of work, and just in 2 minutes, on impulsivity, exposure, and fearlessness about death. And we've done lots of different types of studies. And one of them is that when we try to understand the difference between people who have thoughts of suicide ideators, and they don't go any further, they just think about suicide, and we compare them to people who have attempted suicide, and we compare them to people who have never been suicidal. The key thing that differentiates people who think about suicide from those who attempt suicide is that the people who attempt suicide are more impulsive. They know many more people who have attempted suicide themselves. And the last thing is that they are significantly less fearless about dying. So again, in terms of a message, when we're speaking to somebody who's in crisis, if we're trying to determine whether they're more or less likely to attempt suicide, we need to think about these 3 factors or 4 factors. We need to think about impulsivity. We need to think about exposure. And we need to think about this fearlessness about dying. Okay, so just to try and bring that all together, so what I've tried to convey to you is the importance of psychological factors, and I'll go into more detail in the psychological factors this afternoon. But I think ultimately suicide is a psychological phenomenon, and if we're trying to intervene to help people who are suicidal, we need to understand the way they think about their present, their past, and their future. And to do that, we need to really focus in on understanding ultimately the way they think about the future. We need to think about how they interact with other people who are suicidal, but ultimately we need to help them understand why they're suicidal. Because if we can help somebody understand why they're suicidal, they're less likely to feel trapped. And if they're less likely to feel trapped, hopefully they're less likely to attempt suicide. Thank you.